One of the biggest mistakes that people make in regards to politics is assuming that because someone says something that they agree with, that person must therefore be on their side. They aren't, and neither am I. And before I start pointing fingers at politicians, I should probably acknowledge my own bias. See, I spent many years in the military. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was involved in IED strikes and gun battles, and I spent years and years and years around soldiers, police officers, and people whose job it was to confront reality rather than theorise about it. And those experiences shaped me. They left me with a strong bias towards defence, a secure homeland, personal responsibility, community resilience, and a serious foreign policy. And yes, they did leave me with some concerns about political Islam, religious extremism, and the challenge of integrating fundamentally different cultural values into a liberal democratic society. And I won't pretend otherwise. The difference is that I know that those biases exist. And I don't think that having biases is necessarily the problem, because every human being has them. The problem begins when we pretend we don't. And that's where politics has become very interesting. Because clearly every politician is going to have biases too. Andy Burnham's got biases. Nigel Farage has biases. Rupert Lowe has biases. Kemi Badenoch has biases. And clearly Keir Starmer has biases. Every politician sees the world through a lens shaped by their own personal experiences. Their friendships, their careers, their ambitions, their social circles, their donors, their supporters, their fears and their incentives. The question isn't whether a politician is biased, because the answer is always yes. The real question is, do you understand what those biases are? Because when a politician speaks, most people ask, do I agree with this? And I think a better question should be, why do they believe that? Who benefits? Who influences them? Who do they spend time with? Who funds them? Who shaped their worldview? Literally take any political issue. Some politicians appear unusually sympathetic towards Israel. Others appear unusually sympathetic towards activist groups. Some seem reluctant to confront Islamic extremism. Others seem permanently attached to corporate interests. Some of them even are deeply influenced by trade unions, NGOs, businesses, international institutions, ideology. The answer isn't always corruption necessarily, and it certainly isn't always conspiracy. Most of the time it's going to be influences, relationships, incentives, human nature, because every organised group pursues its own interests. Businesses do it, trade unions do it, religious organisations do it, activists and lobbyists do it. All of these different groups, and they're going to be meshed into this giant network, like web of different competing influences that sometimes come together and sometimes come apart. And that's the environment that we're living in now, where it's just completely confused, congested space of influences all just pulling different directions, and we're right in the middle of it. But that's normal. That's the way that the world works. The real question isn't about whether or not these groups actually pursue influence. The question is whether politicians remain capable of serving the nation as a whole in the midst of all of this confused, congested space of influence. Because eventually every politician faces the same test. Do they represent the public, or instead the people that help them get where they are? And perhaps that's why so many people feel so disillusioned today. Not because politicians disagree, not because parties compete, but because citizens increasingly suspect that nobody is actually representing them anymore. Instead, we're being encouraged to pick a tribe, pick a hero, pick a party, pick a villain, and defend our side no matter what. Politics becomes football, left versus right, red versus blue, good versus evil. But citizenship was never supposed to work like that. The citizen's job is never to trust politicians. The citizen's job is to scrutinise them, always. Not to ask, do I like this person? But what incentives are shaping their decisions? What interests do they represent? What are they not telling me? Because the moment you stop looking for heroes, you start thinking like a citizen. And perhaps that's exactly what those in power fear the most. So let's stop looking for heroes and start understanding the incentives.